Welcome to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. We study change in order to make change, linking knowledge of the past to the quest for a better future. Every other week, we examine the most pressing issues of the day through a historical lens, helping us understand what happened then and what that means for us now. Hi everyone, this is the third and final installment of our event series in partnership with the USC Casden Institute and the Y&S Nazarian Center for Israel Studies at UCLA, titled Deadlock in Israel-Palestine, How to Imagine a Better Future. We hope you enjoy this episode.
I'm Steve Ross, Director of the USC Casden Institute and Professor of History. And on behalf of the Casden Institute and our partners, David Myers and Maya Friedman at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and Dov Waxman at the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion, which is the third installment in an innovative series that has brought together scholars, thinkers, and policymakers, all of whom have different visions, to reflect on the current impasse in Israel-Palestine, and to share proposals for a better future. And it seems to me at a time that Europe is once again ensnared by war, it is especially appropriate to discuss how we can forge an equitable peace in Israel and Palestine. And we are honored to welcome today's distinguished speakers, Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini, who will soon be introduced in greater detail. And for those of you who missed our first two sessions, which were devoted to discussion about how can we move forward in a peace process, you can find recordings of both on the Casden Institute website under our past events. Just Google Casden Institute and it'll come up. As we discovered in our first two installments, for far too long, the gap between the one and two state solutions has prevented an overdue discussion of how to reimagine the conversations between the two nations, both of whom have legitimate roots and claims to the same land. And for this reason, it's our hope to shed light, not heat, on a topic that is generally avoided due to its polarizing nature. And we hope to offer a new dialogue on how to deliver justice, equality, and peace to all inhabitants of the region. All three of our panels have had one common denominator. Our panelists may disagree on many things, but every one of them is committed to moving the peace process forward. At this point, I'd like to introduce my colleague, David Myers, who will in turn introduce today's panelists and moderator. And David is the Sadie and Ludwig Kahn Chair in Jewish History and the Director of the Luskin Center for History and Policy. He previously served as Chair of the UCLA History Department and Director of its Jewish Studies program. David has written extensively in the fields of modern Jewish history. His publications have included Reinventing the Jewish Past, European Jewish Intellectuals and the Zionist Return to History, Between Jew and Arab, The Lost Voice of Simon Radovich, and most recently, American Shtetl, The Making of Kibbutz Joel, a Hasidic village in upstate New York, that he wrote with Nomi Stolzenberg. Most importantly, I want to acknowledge that David and Dov Waxman, who you meet in a moment, have been the organizing brains behind all three of our panels in reimagining this relationship. And I am grateful for this partnership, and I hope that it is the beginning of many more joint events between UCLA and USC. Just a word on today's format. We will begin with a conversation amongst our moderators and panelists, and then the last 20 minutes will be devoted to Q&A. It's my now great pleasure to introduce David Myers, who will in turn introduce our panelists today. David.
Thank you very much, Steve. On behalf of the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, we're really delighted to join as co-sponsors in this series with the Casden Institute at USC. Special thanks to our colleagues there, Lisa Ansell, Caitlin, Troy, Steve, and of course, Steve Ross, who I'm delighted to report has just been appointed to the position of Distinguished Professor at USC, a very rare, prestigious, and richly deserved honor. Congratulations to you, Steve. So UCLA and USC are traditionally thought of as rivals, and last night they were on the basketball court, and there's no need to mention the results of the game here. But we are also partners in the quest for knowledge and the search for solutions to society's problems. That's been the rationale of this three-part series, Breaking the Deadlock, that we've jointly sponsored. We've aimed to put on the table for discussion innovative ideas to create a space in which scholars and activists can think beyond the conventional framing of the Israel-Palestine conflict. And today we're going to revisit the idea of a confederation between Israel and Palestine that, as some of you may recall, figured prominently in our first program last October with Shibli Tahami, Dalia Shinlin, Yuli Tamir, and Omar Rahman. Since that time, our two guests today, Yossi Beilin and Hiba Husseini, have put forward a new high-profile version of the confederation idea. Can this idea contribute to ending the political stalemate that exists between Israelis and Palestinians? Can it incentivize the most resistant parties on the ground to join in support of the idea? How different is it from previously formulated versions of the long-regnant two-state solution? These seem to be key and, in fact, old questions. But part of what is new is that the latest confederation proposal is being promoted by a very formidable pair of negotiators, one Palestinian and one Israeli, both of whom are veterans of the Oslo peace process. Our aim today is to understand how they got where they are today and where they think we are headed. So our two eminent speakers, and I will introduce them very briefly so that we can hear from them, are first Dr. Yossi Beilin, who is a former Israeli cabinet minister, parliamentarian, and politician who is centrally involved in the Oslo process and has been a prime mover behind the Geneva Initiative, an extra-governmental plan to advance the two-state solution. And Hiba Husseini, an internationally renowned lawyer who serves as managing partner of the Husseini and Husseini law firm in Ramallah. She has been a legal advisor to the Palestinian negotiating team since 1994. And to guide the conversation, it's my pleasure now to pass things over to my friend and colleague, Professor Dov Waxman, holder of the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Chair in Israel Studies at UCLA, and director of the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israel Studies, which has been a co-sponsor of this series. Hand things over to you now, Dov.
Thank you, David. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a real honor for me to be moderating this discussion with Dr. Beilin and Dr. Husseini. Long admired their commitment to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, so I'm really grateful to have this opportunity to talk with them about this new plan that was just introduced just a month ago. So we're really fortunate to be able to hear firsthand about what's in this plan and to discuss it. So I want to welcome Dr. Husseini and Dr. Beilin to join me in this conversation. What I'd like to do is begin by talking about how the plan came about before we get into the substance of the plan itself. And then later we can talk about the reception to it and public opinion, and then really how we might move toward actually moving forward with this plan. So let me begin, first of all, by asking you both how you came together to work on this. And what was the process involved in drafting this plan? Perhaps I will start with you, Dr. Beilin.
Thank you very much, and congratulations. I believe that the main motivation was the question of why don't we proceed? What is the main stumbling block? Of course, it is the leaderships. We know that you need somebody who is courageous and ready to pay a price for it, and resourceful, who is ready to talk to the other side and to compromise. And compromises are always difficult. But for years, the general idea was that we cannot proceed because of the difficulty to find the solutions, mainly for the issue of the Palestinian refugees and for Jerusalem, the division of Jerusalem. And because of these difficulties, we cannot proceed. I, for one, got to the conclusion that it is not necessarily this. We know by now, unlike what happened in 93 when I began the Oslo process, but we know by now what the solutions are. And it is the Clinton parameters of 2000 and then the informal Geneva Initiative, which was referred to, and other attempts. So we know it is now very small questions of whether it would be an annexation of 2.25% with full territorial compensation or 4%. But we are there more or less. And we know that with the refugees, what is going to happen is the 5 solutions that were mentioned by the Clinton parameters, and that one of them is also, the main one is returning to the Palestinian future state, and one of the other options is to be absorbed in Israel as full citizens in a relatively symbolic number, besides compensation and things like that. So the main point, at least for the Israeli prime minister, who is the main player in our game, because he is the one or she who have to give something to the other side, which is very tangible. And the main difficulty is the fear of evacuating the settlers. The question was, how can we overcome this point? And one of the solutions is to build a confederation. This is not the only reason for a confederation, but build a confederation in which it would be possible to tell those settlers who will find themselves in the permanent agreement to the east of the new border, if you want, you can stay wherever you are. You will be Israeli citizens and Palestinian residents, permanent residents. And the same number of people, like those settlers who would remain in Palestine, would be Palestinian citizens who will be invited to live in Israel as permanent residents. So that there will be here kind of equality on both sides. Now, another issue was that people told us, not only after Oslo, but also after Geneva, you are dealing with the 67 problem, not with the 48 problem. Meaning you don't deal with the roots of the conflict. And if you are not courageous enough to deal with the roots, you will never solve the conflict. And we thought that it was the right situation to deal with this issue in the context of a confederation. Because if we are going to have a confederation, which is close relationship between 2 sovereign states, it's not a one-state solution, and it is not going to be one-state solution, and we don't want a one-state solution, neither Hiba nor myself. But what we can have is a kind of a close relationship between the 2 states, and here the moral basis is the joint narrative, which had never been written before. It is for the first time that a joint narrative was written, and we believe that it is a very important precedent. So on this basis, we are talking about all the other issues. The main solutions are the solutions of the Geneva Initiative of 2003. We did not touch many points because we didn't want to reinvent the wheel, and we didn't want to waste too much time. We have worked on it almost 3 years. Palestinian specialists, Israeli specialists, legal experts, economists, and others. And what you have in this book, their names, most of them are mentioned, by the way, not all of them. And what you see is the fruit of our work. It should be more detailed. I mean, after writing 100 pages, you understand that you had to write 1,000 pages. And we hope to do that in the future.
So this is the kind of first draft of what you hope will be a much longer, more detailed plan?
Yeah, we did it with the Geneva Initiative at the time. We we published it, and then after a year or two, we began to write the annexes, which were 500 pages, on all the issues which are mentioned in the Geneva Initiative. Here we need also kind of annexes or enlargements of chapters. For example, the legal chapter should be much more detailed than what we have now. And although what we have now is I believe, very important. And the other chapters which we have not referred to, like what will happen in the interim 30 months between signing the agreement and having the Confederation. Because first it would be two separate states, and only then, after 30 months, it would be a confederation. So what will happen exactly in the meantime? And other issues that we have to refer to.
So, Dr. Husseini, Dr. Beilin mentioned that one of the things that's quite distinctive in reading the plan is that there's a significant amount of space devoted to presenting a historical narrative of the conflict. Why? I mean, seems somewhat unusual in a peace plan to focus so much attention on trying to construct a timeline of the conflict. Why did you think that's necessary to put in that and to start with that narrative?
Well, again, thank you for the invitation, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you. And it's a pleasure to have had the opportunity to be involved in this project with Dr. Beilin. I think the issue of the narrative, you cannot, the way we conceive that is that you cannot deal with having a comprehensive presentation of a potentially working scenario for a solution, just equitable solution, without really tackling the difficult issues. And the narrative is definitely one of the most difficult issues. Just like settlers and settlements and Jerusalem and the refugees. So the core and the starting point of this conflict really, to a large extent, derives from the narrative and the different narrative. And of course, the narrative we present is by no means a fully agreed narrative in terms of the stories of both sides. We have different stories. We chose to focus on those facts that give us the ability to present a joint narrative and to challenge the readers and the thinkers and the decision makers into thinking about this issue. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we also did not want to avoid the difficult issues, the complicated issues. Avoiding things in the past got us into trouble and prolonged the conflict. And here we are in a status quo that is not tenable, that is not working for either side. So to present the narrative is an opportunity for us to go beyond the traditional way of thinking about the solution to the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, I was struck by the fact that you're both, veteran peace negotiators, and you've been involved in the Oslo peace process. So in deciding to kind of address these narrative issues, and in the plan itself, you propose the formation of a historical commission to examine the events of the past and to have commemoration of place names and events and text. Is that in part based upon your experience of why previous peace efforts didn't succeed? Was that there wasn't this willingness to address explicitly these very contrasting narratives about the conflict?
Indeed, this is one of the issues. It's very important, again, to set up a mechanism for the two sides to demonstrate that we can discuss difficult issues, emotionally wrenching issues, historically, religiously, without denying each other, without really saying this is, and without the sense that this belongs to me or this belongs to you. If you want to have a solution, a working solution that creates the desired peace, we must be able to talk to each other, acknowledge each other, and relate to each other.
So, Dr. Beilin, you're very much associated with the idea of a two-state solution and the Oslo peace process. And in this plan, it emphasizes the idea that this is not an alternative, not a substitute for a two-state solution, but I think the word you use is a facilitator for one. Can you explain how you see this approach, the approach that you're adopting here, as building upon but departing from the more traditional attempt to reach a two-state solution that you've tried in the past?
Well, here there are some major issues. Take, for example, the issue of the security arrangements and coordination. It is one thing to have coordination on the security matters, which are so important for both sides, between two separate states, which is the usual case, and doing it in a confederation. The confederation, which is a very large definition. You don't have today a confederation anywhere in the world. Only in history we had confederations. So it allows us to invent, in a way, the content of this confederation. But the umbrella may allow us to have, for example, joint situation rooms and to really coordinate in a very intimate way. It is not only that once we have peace, Israel will not knock at nights on the doors of Palestinians in Ramallah and things like that. No, the Palestinians will be in charge of their security, and nobody will intrude at nights or on the days. And Israel will be involved with the strategic security of the borders of the Confederation. When this is the case, it is also easier for the Palestinians to accept the involvement of Israel in coordination with the Palestinians, in cooperation with the Palestinians, in the security matters. And, when we speak about demilitarization or non-militarized state, as it is mentioned in the Clinton parameters and in the Geneva Initiative, there is a question, what is the way the Palestinians are going to defend themselves? Now, one of the solutions, and it is mentioned in our relevant chapter, is the international forces. But Israel and Palestine can be involved in these international forces, and it is easier to do it under the umbrella of a confederation. Now, many other things like infrastructure, natural resources. I don't have to tell you it is such a small area. You're always comparing it to a city in the United States and say it's not bigger than that or whatever. And to have an artificial border, and any border will be artificial, is very problematic. You cannot stop the road at this artificial border and not do anything with the other side of the border. So the Confederation may allow us really to use this small area in a much more efficient way, which is very important.
So I want to get now into some of the details of this plan, and you've mentioned a few of them. I'll begin with, I think, what is probably the most controversial aspect of any confederation plan, and this is the idea that after Israel annexes settlements, large settlement blocks along the Green Line, the remaining settlers, who, according to plan number nearly 200,000, who would be given the choice of either remaining in place as residents of a Palestinian state while retaining their Israeli citizenship. And this, you mentioned in your earlier comment, Dr. Beilin, is a response to maybe the political impossibility of any Israeli government actually withdrawing something like 200,000 settlers in the event of a peace agreement. But I think and I want to ask you both about this from the Israeli side. One big objection would be that, these settlers, as you well know, are among the more ideological, the ones who would be the more messianically inclined, the more extremist, surely they would not accept to live in a Palestinian state, even as while retaining their citizenship. And even if they did, wouldn't there be a real security risk that they would try essentially to torpedo, they would act as spoilers of any peace agreement, to draw back in maybe the IDF to come to their defense if they were provoked some kind of an attack? Or so is that not a kind of time bomb, essentially, by leaving 200,000 settlers in a future Palestinian state?
I can see a situation whereby, if this is the peace agreement, any Israeli settler who would like to stay in the Palestinian state will have to sign a paper which says that he and she will abide by the Palestinian rules. Now, if they do sign, but don't obey, and the Palestinian state will come to us and say, hey, look at these people. They are doing awful things. I mean, we did not expect such visitors or guests in our country. Israel will have to take them back. But they will not be the ones who will veto the whole project. What you are saying is, of course, not baseless. And there is such a concern. But it doesn't mean that the whole project is impossible.
So, Dr. Husseini, I want to ask you about this issue of having these, anywhere around 200,000 settlers. These are the settlers who live deeper in the heartland of the West Bank, not in the large settlement blocks bordering it. Settlers who, have had, to put it mildly, a tense relationship with Palestinians in surrounding areas, settlers in some cases who have attacked and terrorized local Palestinians. How could Palestinians be convinced to allow this population, who they see as invaders, as colonialists, to stay in place? And how could they be convinced not to harm or otherwise harass this group?
I mean, yes, you are asking a very difficult question, a very complex issue, no doubt about that. And it's a very, very big compromise for the Palestinians to make in the negotiations, like for the Confederation. But we are trying to offer solutions that could incentivize the parties to overcome some of the most difficult obstacles, the settlements and the blocks and the ideological settlers. It will take some ironing out of a lot of details as to numbers, as to qualifications. Remember, they will be permanent residents of Palestine. At that time, it would be a sovereign state. It would have a peace agreement with the state of Israel. So there would be some guarantees and some mechanisms to ensure the security of both people. So Palestinian security would also have to be safeguarded and to have to be provided. So these settlers, I hope they would eventually become called permanent residents, not settlers. And that would be the legal standing of them, and they would have to behave accordingly. Again, they have the option, if they don't want to be a permanent resident in the state of Palestine and an abiding permanent resident, they can leave and express their ideological tendencies in the other blocks that have been swapped and exchanged. So again, not easy. We're not proposing very easy solutions. We're offering thinking outside the box so that we want to demonstrate that the most difficult issues can be tackled. And again, it will require a lot of hard work.
And so the idea is that for whatever number of Israeli settlers are allowed to become permanent residents of Palestine, an equivalent number of Palestinians would be permitted to become permanent residents of Israel while retaining their citizenship in Israel. So there's this kind of sense that there would be proportional numbers on both sides. But as I read the plan, that doesn't refer these Palestinians becoming permanent residents of Israel to refugees. There's a separate approach to the number of Palestinians. Who would be Palestinian refugees who would be either permitted to return to Israel or to a future Palestinian state or third party. Is this essentially the same approach as put forward in the Geneva Accords of 2003, or is this in terms of the approach specifically on the Palestinian refugee question?
On the refugees, this is the solution of Geneva. And this is the solution is the following one. The refugees will have these 5 venues of the Clinton parameters, namely where they are living now, in a third country, of course, in Palestine itself, in the swap lands that will be handed over from the Israeli sovereignty to the Palestinian sovereignty, and in Israel itself. Now, in Israel itself, the number of the refugees who will be absorbed and become citizens, not residents, will be the same as the average number of refugees who will be absorbed in third countries. This is the Geneva Initiative. We did not change it. So you will have, according to our plan, 3 kinds of Arabs on the Israeli side. One is the Israeli citizens, the Israeli Arabs. They are not part of the agreement, and they will not have, there will be no change in their status. The second is those who will become Israeli residents but not citizens. And the third one are the refugees who will become full citizens, like the Israeli Arabs.
And so the idea is that in making these kind of distinctions, you can allow for the implementation of some right of return while addressing the demographic fears of Israeli Jews, essentially.
Exactly.
I see. Dr. Husseini, do you think this approach to the refugee question and the right of return would be something that Palestinians would, particularly Palestinian refugees, because essentially the connection between their ability to exercise their right of return seems to be tied toward the willingness of third countries to accept refugees as well. And we now know that nowadays, we're seeing challenges to refugees being accepted around the world. How do you think that approach would it be acceptable? Is there a shift in terms of how Palestinians view the right of return?
Well, it is not a condition, actually, the way we envisage this proposal, that there would be a third-party acceptance of a certain number as a precondition. Rather, the categories that are discussed, that were discussed in Geneva and the Clinton parameters, and actually other initiatives, all pretty much revolve around the same suggestions, in that the refugee would also have a choice as to where they would like to go. So under this potentially international mechanism for the rehabilitation and repatriation and compensation based on the right of return, the refugees can express themselves and can choose. So, but then the negotiations will figure out the exact numbers and the mechanism, and subject to various, of course, immigration laws and refugee-related legislation in third countries. Remember, we also have a large number that is already that has already taken citizenship in third countries like Canada, Australia, the Scandinavian countries, and other European states that permitted Palestinian refugees to become citizens. So again, there would be this mechanism that would allow the refugee to choose. And most have always expressed their desire to come back to Palestine. They want to become citizens of the state of Palestine, as opposed to the state of Israel. They have some, we don't have concrete statistics quite yet on a referenda or so forth, but the general feel is that they would want to return to the state of Palestine. So we'd have to establish also very large absorption projects in terms of housing, healthcare, education, what have you. So it's going to be a process.
So the idea is really to kind of accept in principle the right of return, while in practice providing many different ways for that to be realized.
It's more complicated, because what we said in the Geneva Initiative is that the agreement that we will have about the refugees will be the implementation of the UN Resolution 194 and from December 48. And that is the point. It is not that Israel recognizes the right of return. This is always the question of titles and whatever. But practically what will happen is that a number of it will be at least tens of thousands of Palestinians will enter Israel as citizens. By the way, if, for example, because of the international situation, no third party will accept the Palestinians, it will not cause this Israeli decision to do the same. Because the other option, for example, was, in my agreement with President Abbas in 1995, we referred to family reunification and special cases, which is a kind of an open definition. Here we were more, in Geneva, we were more specific. But that might become the alternative, the immediate alternative to a situation of a world which closes the gates for refugees.
So we've talked about two of the most difficult issues: the question of the borders and the future of settlements and refugees. I want to ask you about the question of Jerusalem, which has been the issue that really has torpedoed previous rounds of peace talks, most famously at Camp David in July 2000. The approach you adopt in the plan is to still call for a division of Jerusalem initially, as opposed to, I think, some other Confederation ideas, which basically just say Jerusalem is undivided at the moment, at least in legally, and it should remain so. Your approach seems to call for, first of all, a redivision before then Jerusalem becoming an open city. Can you explain kind of the logic of that, of trying to divide to Jerusalem and trying to establish sovereignty and then allow it to become an open city, rather than maybe not settling the question of sovereignty?
No. We are settling the issue of sovereignty. It might be solved also in other ways, like joint sovereignty. But we did not decide about joint sovereignty. What we are suggesting is a very specific map of a division of Jerusalem, so that everybody will know exactly where his or her Jerusalem begins and where it ends. Which doesn't mean that it would be like in my childhood, a wall, a very ugly one, by the way, between East and West Jerusalem. This will not be the case anymore. Now, an open area will be the old city, which is less than 1 square kilometers. There, you have to enter from one gate and get out from the same gate. But the other parts of Jerusalem will still be divided. And Jerusalem itself will not be an open city. Why? Because if Jerusalem, which is the largest city in Israel, more than 100 square kilometers, is open tomorrow, it means that both sides will have to close it from its outset. If every Palestinian can enter West Jerusalem, every Israeli can enter East Jerusalem, then they can, and it is an open city, they can proceed. And in the current situation, we don't see this option a realistic one. In the future, I believe that this will be the case. But what we are doing, and this is the main difference between our suggestion and some other suggestions, which are not far from it, is the graduality. I mean, to say that tomorrow there is a freedom of movement and goods and people can work wherever and live wherever, we would like to see such a situation, and we hope that it will happen. And we are even building a structure that every 4 years, the two governments have to sit together and deal with the issues of liberalizing the borders and other arrangements. But it will not happen in one day. And this is why it is important for us to begin in a more modest way and to see how does it work. We are not sure that it is a success story.
Yeah, there's certainly a kind of modesty in the plan itself, in recognizing that, at one point, I think you're right, that this may not work, and parties may want to leave, and it may become a kind of traditional two-state solution. Which is fine.
I mean, we will not demonstrate against it. We in the two-state solution. This is the main thing. The Confederation is really a tool for it, but it is not only a tool because of its educational and social ramifications. It is an important structure, but we are aware of the fact that there are no confederations in the world, and it might be only a tool.
Well, you say there are no confederations in the world, but as you note in the plan, the European Union is effectively a kind of confederation.
Yeah, this is true, but they don't accept this
spirit.
Yeah, no doubt. This is our model. This is what we would like to see in the future. And one of the important things is that it is gradual. In the beginning, in the 50s, they were very far from the current point.
So in that respect, I want to ask you, a little bit more about this adopting this gradual approach, because that seems, there's been, a lot of talk in recent years about confederation ideas, and there's the Eretz Ha'Kulam, the share one homeland, two states approach. Is the difference between this approach, your confederation plan, the Holy Land Confederation, and these other, the idea that it adopts this more kind of gradual step by step, rather than just saying, well, already there's a one state reality? It seems the one homeland, two states model kind of says there's a one state reality. We could essentially maintain open borders, free movement, have Jerusalem as an undivided city. Whereas this approach seems more geared towards initially having some separation and then gradually moving towards greater and greater integration. Is that correct?
I don't want to speak on their behalf, but I believe that they don't exclude the one-state solution in the future.
Right.
While without saying it, we don't see the one-state solution as a solution. For somebody, I can speak for myself. As a Zionist, the one-state solution is against the vision of people like myself. I will be totally against it. It is not that I will not prefer it. I will be totally against it if it is on the agenda. Thanks heaven, it is not on the agenda at all. Neither the Palestinians nor us are enthusiastic about a one-state solution. They deserve their self-determination right, and we deserve to stay a Jewish state, provided that we are not taking the rights of the Palestinians.
Dr. Husseini, I think for the Palestinians, there has been at least some shift in public opinion, particularly among younger Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, who are increasingly open to this idea of a one-state solution, and maybe shifting away from the whole idea of Palestinian statehood toward equality within a single state. Do you think this confederation approach is in a way of saving this idea of Palestinian sovereignty, of statehood, and not just as opposed to this kind of shift of public opinion of young people in particular toward a one-state solution?
I believe so. Yeah, I mean, I think as Dr. Beilin said, most Palestinians really don't want a one-state solution. I, for sure, don't want a one-state solution. So, and that's why I've been working all of these years on the two-state solution. That makes the idea of the Confederation more and more attractive because it gives the Palestinians the right to self-determination and the sovereignty that they really we have been seeking. And it also allows us to share the old city with potentials opening of the rest of Jerusalem, as Dr. Beilin said, later on in time. Now, I think the youth are coming from a completely different perspective. The youth are frustrated with the existing status quo. They don't see a horizon. They don't see a perspective. And they believe that if the land is shared and they have equal rights, assuming they would, then that provides them with the horizon and the freedom and the liberty that they really have been seeking. So it arises out of frustration with the current status quo, not realizing perhaps that, from my perspective, a one-state solution would not give equal rights. You need two governments, you need two sets of institutions, you need a sovereign state. I mean, if you have to have a way to address all the legal issues as a Palestinian in a one state, in a democracy, in a state. Israel defines itself as a Jewish state. I mean, how can a Palestinian fit within that description, really, and within that ideology? So it would be a very difficult scenario when you come to test it, if should we ever get to that stage. I mean, we've seen time and again, and last May was a demonstration of the frustration, and it was the youth actually who took to the streets, the very same youth. So they have contradictions in the way they see the conflict and they see the solutions to the conflict. I think the Confederation, again, offers this opportunity for the sovereignty and for the independence with incremental steps rather than interim steps. And I distinguish in the sense that we, in the structure we are proposing, we would negotiate the agreement, the peace agreement, and we would negotiate the the implementation plan. So when we come to joining the Confederation, we would already have reached agreement on the issues. So in that respect, the Confederation is a very good pragmatic tool to allow the parties to move forward. We have to break the impasse. I mean, I think this is what.
And the idea is to start with statehood. Is that right? That instead of having statehood in the Oslo process is the end of the process, it begins with statehood as the beginning of the process. And even if the remit of a Palestinian state is limited initially to about 30% of the West Bank, areas A and B, 40% of the West Bank, the idea is that you start with a state and then work beyond that.
Yeah, but that's correct. But you would also have had the opportunity to negotiate the details. It's the implementation that will take time.
I see.
And we set the timeline for that as well. And that's why we believe it's very attractive.
And another element of this is the recognition that it doesn't really require either side to entirely give up their belief in the integrity of the whole land, right? That both sides could have access to religious and historical sites in the other's territory. Neither side has to entirely forsake their historical claims. Do you think that, you're well aware of the kind of rejectionists on both sides who have always opposed the classic two-state solution because it required them to essentially forsake their notion of a historical homeland or religious or the sacredness of the land. Do you see this approach then as maybe helping reach out to some religious conservatives or nationalist conservatives on both sides, even among Hamas, who have previously been unwilling to recognize or give up the historic claim to the whole territory? Dr. Husseini, do you think that there may be some members of Hamas or Hamas's leadership for whom this approach could be more acceptable because it still doesn't require them to absolutely kind of give up this idea of the integrity of historic Palestine?
Of course, I cannot speak for them, but I think it offers a scenario that can be considered seriously. It would not be seen as a total compromise on their ideological, historical demands for what they see and perceive to be. To them, it's all Palestine, of course. And in that respect, the sanctity of the land is preserved, the integrity of the land is preserved. So both sides can see and get that sense that the land belongs shared under a confederation. Can be a way of presenting it, but again, we would have to test the scenario at that level. And of course, this is not a plan that is going to be put to a veto by one side or the other, but rather it's going to be a national decision to move into it, and we would have to iron out the internal issues for sure by then.
So I wonder, was that, Dr. Beilin, part of the thinking behind calling it a Holy Land Confederation? I mean, specifically recognizing the religious significance of the territory in a way that critics of the Oslo peace process, it was a secular process. It didn't necessarily explicitly try to get that kind of religious legitimization.
The answer is yes, but the idea of people who are, most of us are very secular people on both sides. But the point is to have a name which will not be just a Israeli-Palestinian confederation, but something which is larger than that and opens perhaps an option for other partners in the future.
You mentioned Jordan in that context.
Yeah. I don't think that it can happen immediately, but maybe in the future they will join something, a structure like that. But your question, I think, is very relevant, because somehow, if the borders are more permeable, then you really enable people to feel that they are not giving up totally. And this is very important, not necessarily for religious people or the extremists, but for Israelis, for Jews, not Israelis, for Jews, places like Hebron are much more relevant historically than Tel Aviv or Herzliya. So if you say, okay, if you want to go to Hebron, so you can go there. It will not be such an impossible thing, and vice versa. Then it may be easier, even if this process doesn't happen in one day, and depends on the developments. If hatred is lower and the risks are lower for both sides, then it can be more open. But in the context of the European Union, you move from one place to another, and sometimes you don't know whether you are in France or in Belgium or wherever, but the borders are there, and if you look at the map, they are very clear.
That's right. It seems that there's a tension there, because on the one hand, absolutely, I think the idea of open borders or freedom of movement is very appealing and would appeal to many who would fear the kind of loss of access, that separation, the kind of traditional two-state separation would entail. On the other hand, permeable or open borders obviously raises security concerns, especially for Israel, which is, built a barrier to try to prevent freedom of movement and to close the border. So, how do you assuage or address the concerns that many Israeli Jews would have that would say, well, it's all very well for us to be able to go to Hebron and we'd like that, but we don't want Palestinians from Hebron coming to in great numbers into Israel. In other words, this idea of open borders is frightening for many Israeli Jews.
Yeah, it cannot be one side open. I mean, if it is open, then it is open for both sides. That is very clear. But the concerns will be met by graduality. This is my hope.
And Dr. Husseini, do you think from the Palestinian side, some of the, in terms of the security measures, which has become increasingly difficult in negotiations, to agree to the idea that Israeli forces would be continued to allow to operate in a Palestinian? So with the permission of the Palestinian government, would that be something, and the kind of restrictions on Palestinian security forces, restrictions on Palestine's ability to enter alliances, would these kinds of maybe restrictions on Palestinian sovereignty or qualifications be something that Palestinians would be willing to accept? It seems in recent years that at least President Abbas has taken a harder line on the security issues than he did in the agreement, for example, with Dr. Beilin back in 1995.
Well, there are two aspects to your question. Number one, Israeli security forces would not be allowed to operate in the state of Palestine. There, we are proposing in the chapter there would be coordination and cooperation. So an Israeli security force would not be able to enter as they do now. They would be breaching a sovereign state. So before they enter, should they be allowed to enter, they would have to coordinate first. So this is not a scenario where you have the military vehicles and the soldiers just coming into a home and deciding to grab this kid or that person on suspicion. Again, there would be a system of sharing intelligence and so forth and so on. On the other hand, we are going to be a demilitarized state. So we are not going to have an army and an air force. Of course, civilian police and civilian the use of airspace and so forth would be part of the sovereignty exercised by the state of Palestine. But to coordinate and on the outer security issues, of course, that's very complicated. It is going to be extremely complicated to reach the compromises that both sides, that Israel requires and the Palestinians would have to give up. And in some scenarios, there would have to be, as we have always proposed, some sort of international presence. So again, this is not an easy issue. This is not an easy proposal. There would probably be scenarios where more cooperation would take place, less cooperation would take place. I think we have proven, though, that despite all the difficulties we are facing today, and in the past 12 years and the last actually 20 years, that security coordination has been maintained. There have been lots of hiccups along the way, but all in all, it has been one of the areas where we have had continued cooperation. Of course, we don't appreciate the fact that Israeli forces just come in at any moment in time, and they detain and act without respect to the accords. But I think this would have to change, and what we are proposing is a different scenario.
So thank you. So we've talked in some detail about the substance of the plan, and before I open it up and ask some questions that have been coming in from the audience, I want to ask you about the reception that you've received so far to this plan. And you've already presented it to the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, to members of the Biden administration, I think the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, among others, and to some Democrats in Congress. What's been the reception that you've been receiving so far, the level of interest, the seriousness with which this plan's being taken?
All those people were very supportive. So maybe you can say that we went to the audience which would support us by definition. For example, there were no meetings with Republican senators or members of the House of Representatives.
Did you request a meeting with them out of curiosity?
Pardon?
Did you try to meet with them? I mean, or you focused more on the Democrats initially?
Yeah, we focused on Democrats. But all of them, all the names that you mentioned, including Ms. Barbara Leaf and others, were very, very, very supportive and were ready to help. And that is very, very encouraging. I mean, the secret is that if Palestinians and Israelis are coming together and say, we have an idea, we have a solution, I don't think that anybody in the world will say, no, here you gave up on too much or something like this. Maybe Trump may say so, but others will not say so. So the question is, of course, the public opinion in Palestine and in Israel. What would they say about it? So far, I did not meet harsh opposition, but maybe because the issue is not salient enough yet.
You negotiated famously a draft peace agreement with President Abbas before he was president back in 1995. Do you think this is something, I mean, knowing him and having negotiated with him in the past and concluded an agreement, do you think this is something that he might find acceptable? And I want to ask Dr. Husseini about Palestinian public opinion, but Dr. Beilin, do you think this could be acceptable, at least to the Palestinians? I don't think Prime Minister Bennett is likely to be anytime soon.
No, he's against the two-state solution, so there is no sense of even presenting it to him. But we are going to present it together to the Israeli president, Mr. Herzog, in 2 weeks. And I hope that we will also present it to President Abbas. He got the paper. With him, I agreed that the settlers in the West Bank might remain there. So it is not new to him, and he agreed to it. Not in Gaza, but only in the West Bank. Today, Gaza is not an issue at all. And he also said publicly that a confederation with Jordan and Israel is something that he would like to think about seriously. Unsolicited. I mean, that was, I think, 2 years ago. It publicly said so. So I don't think that he would be against it, but I cannot speak on his behalf. And maybe Dr. Husseini can do that.
Dr. Husseini, do you think this would be acceptable in terms of Palestinian public opinion, but also in terms of the President Abbas and PLO leadership?
Well, so far, in terms of the leadership and President Abbas, again, we're waiting for our meeting and we're hoping to receive a confirmation. So far, those with whom I've shared the book expressed support for exploring all potential scenarios and solutions, again, to move us out of this impasse and stalemate. So there was no rejection. There has been no rejection outright. And from the limited reaction so far at the public level, I have not seen or come across articles or opinions or statements or on social media or in the newspapers condemning it in any way. Again, we have not had the opportunity to disseminate it at large yet. It's out there, of course, people see it. What has happened is that I received a lot of interest by news outlets and media in the Arab world, actually, from Morocco to Egypt to locally, some outlets that broadcast in the Arabic language that requested interviews. And we had some of actually joint ones, Dr. Beilin and myself, while we were in Washington with some of the Arabic-speaking media. Addressing the issue to the public. Some of the, I'll just share this with you because some of the interviews that were scheduled have been postponed due to the current crisis and war in Ukraine. So I haven't had a lot of reactions quite yet. But a lot of people contacted me and they wanted to work on a media campaign and people are looking for a way to move forward.
Absolutely. I mean, the theme of this our three-part lecture series has been on trying to think about ways to break the deadlock, and I think there is a desire to do so. I want to turn to some of the questions that have been coming in from the audience, and one picks up on this about the issue in Palestinian politics today seems to be, I mean, both sides more domestically focused. In the West Bank, the question of the issue of succession and the future of Palestinian politics, and there's a big. Is the timing now? I mean, this plan in introducing this plan now at a time where it seems neither side is focused on their conflict and rather focus on their own internal issues. Does that make it very difficult to move forward? I mean, is there too much volatility, the question asks, is there too much volatility in Palestinian domestic politics right now, or likely to be volatility in the years to come? That would just make it very difficult for any leader to kind of accept this, and let alone implement it.
Well, I think there's some, that opinion is certainly correct to some extent, though. I don't think we're proposing a scenario or a plan that would be taken up today by both sides, realizing that domestically on both sides there are difficulties. It's paving the way to moving forward, and while there are challenges domestically, and the focus is on the internal issues, whether it's within the PLO and or internally between Fatah and Hamas, that would not preclude. We didn't believe that this would preclude the larger issue of the two-state solution or the conflict or the peace process. I think if you have a good plan and one that is reasonable, logical, makes sense, it will allow the parties, either the internal domestic issues, to even move forward. So I have not had any reactions in terms of the timing that this is wrong for us. You know, why is it out now?
Let me ask the same question to Dr. Beilin, and we had another question asking about, you know, there's this interim period, a 30-month interim period that the plan, or transitional period that the plan envisages. What would happen if a different government came to power in Israel, which, you know, didn't support the idea, and given the distinct possibility in Israeli politics as well. We saw this obviously during the Oslo peace process with Mr. Prime Minister when Netanyahu became Prime Minister, and it really undermined the peace. Where do you see, how can you kind of protect against that possible scenario?
We are speaking about something which is different than the Oslo Agreement. The Oslo Agreement was an interim agreement by definition according to the Madrid Conference of 91. Here we are speaking about a permanent agreement which will be signed according to our chart in a year time. Once it is signed and there is the mutual recognition, we are speaking about 30 months for implementation. This is not a transitional period. It is just implementation. You have to do many, many things. For example, moving military components from the West Bank to Israel and other things like that. But we already should agree by then about the parameters of the Confederation and about all the other things, including the border, and it is not conditioned by anything. It's not that if in these 30 months one side doesn't behave, then we don't have an agreement. This is going to happen. Now, if there is a different government and it doesn't want to implement it, it is breaching an international agreement, which may happen and should not happen. Hopefully, if it is such a peace treaty, it would be very, very difficult to breach it by just saying, I don't like it. But how can we assure it? It is very difficult. And the agreement with Iran and the decision of President Trump is a good example, but also a very bad one.
Absolutely. But we have a question from Barbara Landau on that, who asked about, would there be some kind of mechanism to ensure compliance or even international adjudicators, perhaps, to both make sure that both sides are living up to their commitments and implementing them and calling them out if they fail to do so?
Yeah, there is a process of dealing with differences, including negotiations and mediation and arbitration and all these things, which do not exist with Oslo Agreement.
So would the this is a question also about the kind of the implementation of this agreement. Is there mechanisms, you mentioned kind of oversight mechanisms, but in terms of the ability of these two future states to continue to work together, can you talk a bit about the institutions that the plan envisages, not just because it's detailed and talking about establishing a number of institutions, joint institutions that would exist to implement. Can you say something about what these institutions would be in what areas? Perhaps Dr. Husseini, would you say?
Well, I think, okay, sure. I was going to defer this to Dr. Beilin because I'm getting a bit tired, but that's okay. The institutions would be joined, and we are proposing to have them in the various fields, from economic to environment and water, natural resources, of course, to legal, and pretty much on all issues, in order to these are joint institutions that mirror the national institutions, and then they would deal with the joint issues. For again, ironing out issues, checking the mechanisms for implementation. These are institutions where disputes may first be presented and dealt with and worked out. So, this is the whole idea, is that the Confederation, after establishment, would have these joint institutions to deal with a range of issues, including security, as I said, economic, natural resources, legal, visitation, immigration, residency.
And the idea would be that the membership on these bodies would be an equal number of Israelis and Palestinians, and in some cases some also international involvement.
We did not refer to international involvement. It might be a good idea. And these institutions will not be binding, and the resolutions will not be binding. It will be all of them will be advisory. This is a kind of a confederation which I would say, at least at the beginning, is very mild. Now, on any issue, as Dr. Husseini said, it is a kind of a mirror of the each state's institutions. So agriculture, for example, health, for example, experts will sit together permanently, not just visit each other in this organization. From time to time, the political leaders will join them in their discussions, and they will suggest ideas to the two governments. Now, if the two governments reject them, or one of them rejects it, then it will not happen. So we are not going to have a one leader, one parliament, one government, or something now. Maybe in the future, exactly like the EU. If you remember at the beginning, it was members of the state parliaments who met with each other several times a year, and that was the European Parliament. Sometimes when I wanted to see a members of parliament of a certain country, they would say to me, let us meet in Strasbourg because we are having a meeting of the European Parliament. It is not so important, so I have enough time to speak, something like that. So we may have something like that in the future, but in the beginning, it will be only advisory institutions which will deal, for example, an issue like the corona. Usually the corona doesn't stop at the border. And in such a small area, you must coordinate. And so there is no reason why they want to sit together experts, doctors on both sides, and will decide whether there is a good enough reason to have a booster or not, or things like that. This is the idea of these institutions. We just took the lists of ministries on both sides and say, okay, you must sit together and discuss. And you have to suggest ideas. Nobody promises you that these ideas will be accepted. But this is really, you institutionalize the cooperation and the coordination in such a way that it is a kind of a confederation without many of the characteristics of a confederation with one leader, maybe in rotation, or one parliament, and so on.
So it's interesting. I mean, yes, along this kind of spectrum from shared sovereignty to complete separation, this plan seems to allow for a great deal of flexibility, that they can almost move, almost depending upon changing circumstances and political conditions, as we see in the European Union, moving toward either pooling of sovereignty and intense cooperation, or moving in the other direction, as opposed to, say, the more traditional two-state models, which are kind of a fixed. There isn't, once they've adopted it, that's fixed. Was this flexibility in a way built upon both of your understanding of why some of these proposals in the past didn't succeed, because they didn't allow for that? They were kind of rigid plans in a certain way.
That is correct. Yeah, I mean the rigidity of the positions did not allow the parties to really negotiate the issues in a manner that would offer each side wanted the maximum position. This plan gives them the maximum without really having to give up a lot of issues, and maximum in the sense that they can express the integrity and the sanctity of the land, have a border that would allow them to have greater cooperation. The old city is an open city. So you have a lot of elements to the plan that would allow that flexibility and to give you the sense that you have maximized your demands and requests and realize those as well, without having to give up a great deal.
So we're running out of time, and we've got more questions coming in, but one question comes in asking about the Palestinian government, and particularly the question of Hamas and the Gaza Strip. The Hamas rule in the Gaza Strip is obviously one major issue that would prevent this plan from coming into being anytime soon. How would it be possible does the plan first of all require essentially Palestinian reunification, Palestinians to achieve a single government and then move towards this, or are you proposing that this can happen even while Hamas continues to rule in the Gaza Strip?
Without making a comparison, as we don't want that the settlers will determine the possibility of peace treaty by saying, okay, we already settled all over the West Bank, and as a result of it, there is no place for a Palestinian state. We don't want Hamas to tell us that because we don't want peace, you cannot make peace. So what does it mean? We are going to have, according to our plan, a peace treaty between Israel and the PLO. Now, the PLO is the only recognized representative of the Palestinian people in the Arab League, in the world at large. Now, once we have an agreement, and Hamas says, you know what, I changed my mind, I want to be part of it, be my guest, then there is a safe passage between the West Bank and Gaza, and Hamas Gaza is part of the peace treaty. Of course, it has to recognize Israel and to be part of this agreement. If Hamas says, you traitors, you gave up on the Holy Land and to the Jews, and we don't want to be part of it, then practically the agreement may be implemented only in the West Bank, leaving an open door for Gaza in the future to join when it changes its mind this way or another. Now, in the meantime, we may think about a kind of a long ceasefire between Israel and Hamas and peace with the PLO. Maybe this is possible. I'm not sure about it. But anyhow, there should not be a precondition for us to have peace with the Palestinians if they are united, because they may not be united, regretfully, for long.
Just an additional comment, a quick one. I think in this proposal, we see that the territory of Palestine is one. In other words, it's Gaza, West Bank, and the negotiated parts of East Jerusalem. So we don't see that the land and the integrity of the land. Again, here we want to maintain the integrity of the land, not divide the land even further. So, but at the political level, of course, it's going to be the PLO that will negotiate, as is recognized by the entire world. And by then we would hope that there would be unity, but the unity is not a precondition.
I see. So my final very quick question before I conclude, what are the next steps for this? I mean, you mentioned that you're going to be meeting with President Abbas, presenting this to the Palestinian leadership. Is there a plan to promote this among Israelis and Palestinians more broadly on public opinion? And where do you see, how do we get to this proposal? How do you see the next steps?
Well, this is exactly, the dissemination of the plan and getting to every household, as we did in the past with the Geneva Initiative, and meeting with the leaders of the world, making it a talking point with the Israeli leadership and things like that. This is the only way that we can do it as an informal, unofficial group.
and continue meeting with people like yourselves and other think tanks, academic institutions, governments who invite us to speak or to share their book with them, provide feedback and input, and plan a larger dissemination.
Well, we're very grateful that you chose to spend this time with us to introduce this very new plan. I will make sure it's on the Nazarian Center's website, and I'm sure we can post it on our other websites so people are made widely aware of this. It is, to my knowledge, the most detailed plan for Confederation that I've seen. There's a lot of talk about it, but this really puts it into real details and explaining how it works. And I want to thank you both for really talking it through with us today and explaining and answering so patiently many of the questions that I put to you. And to wish you, Ray, all the success in the world as you promote this plan and get attention to it. I want to thank you both, and now turn over to my colleague, Steve Ross, for some concluding remarks.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There's an old saying, why are academic politics so vicious? Because the stakes are so low. Here we have a discussion where the stakes are very high. And what I want to say, it's always easy to criticize what does not work in any proposal. What's difficult and much harder is to see where both parties might begin to agree and then move forward. And I have to say, for both Yossi and Hiba, I have to applaud your courage, because this is one of those instances where no good deed goes unpunished. I'm sure you're getting much more criticism than you are getting thanks. But in this session today, we want to thank you for giving us a vision of what a Holy Land Confederation could look like if designed with a plurality of voices and representation at the table, all of whom are seeking justice. I want to thank both of you for taking the time to appear with us today. I want to thank again David Myers and Maya Ferdman at the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy, and our moderator today, Dov Waxman at the UCLA Nazarian Center for Israeli Studies, for sharing our vision together. And now for just a few closing comments, I turn it over to my colleague, David Meyer. David.
I just wanted to say thank you, extend my thanks to Dr. Beilin and Dr. Husseini, and of course, my colleague, Dov Waxman, for putting on the table the kinds of ideas that we need to engage and that hopefully will lead to better and more peaceful times. Thank you, Steve, for your partnership, and we look forward to more.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this.
For having us here.
It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to our audience today for tuning in. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Then and Now, a podcast by the UCLA Luskin Center for History and Policy. You can learn more about our work or share your thoughts with us at our website, luskincenter.history.ucla.edu. Our show is produced by David Myers and Maya Ferdman, with original music by Daniel Reichman. Special thanks to the UCLA History Department for its support, and thanks to you for listening.